Don't let him touch anything." The words cut clean through the polished air of the gallery, sharp and immediate, like a switch flipping off whatever quiet dignity had been there before. Every head turned at once, not toward the speaker, but toward the man standing beside the scale model of the city, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of a miniature steel bridge no wider than a ruler. Marcus Reed didn't pull his hand back right away. He just looked at it, at the cold metal beneath his fingertips, as if it meant something more than what anyone else in the room could see. A security guard stepped in quickly, firm but not aggressive, guiding his arm away, and the movement alone drew a ripple of low murmurs across the room. The gallery lights reflected off glass cases and chrome accents, casting a sterile glow over everything. Over tailored suits, polished shoes, and the massive display labeled New City Vision, a project worth billions, a promise of reinvention. And in the middle of it all, Marcus stood out without trying. His coat was worn at the edges, his shoes scuffed from miles of walking sidewalks most people drove past without noticing, and yet there was something in the way he stood, still, grounded, that didn't quite match the label people had already placed on him. Ethan Caldwell approached from the far side of the room, his presence shifting the atmosphere before he even spoke. Conversations lowered. Phones tilted subtly to capture the moment. "We have a presentation to run," Ethan said, his voice calm, controlled, carrying just enough weight to settle the room. His eyes moved to Marcus, not with anger, but with something colder, dismissal sharpened into habit. "This isn't a public exhibit." Marcus finally lifted his hand away from the model, but his gaze lingered on it, tracing invisible lines between streets, bridges, and blocks as if he were reading something no one else could. A piece of metal, no bigger than a coin, had come loose near the base of the structure, and he bent slightly to pick it up. No rush, no apology, just a quiet, deliberate motion. A few people near the front exchanged glances, one of them letting out a small, incredulous laugh that echoed louder than intended. "Sir," the guard said, softer now, "you need to step away." Marcus straightened, holding the small fragment between his fingers. He didn't pocket it, didn't hide it. He just looked at it, then back at the model, and for a second, just a second, the distance between him and everything in that room seemed to collapse into something tighter, heavier. Ethan watched him closely now, brows drawing together ever so slightly, not in recognition, but in irritation at the disruption. "Whatever you think you're doing," Ethan said, taking a step closer, "this isn't the place." The room stilled again, waiting. Marcus's eyes moved across the display one last time. The towers, the foundations, the careful symmetry. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried anyway. "This won't hold," he said, almost to himself, the words landing with a quiet certainty that didn't match his appearance. A pause followed, thin and stretched, like something about to snap. Then a few scattered chuckles broke through, quickly growing into a wave of amusement that rolled across the room. Someone lifted their phone higher. Someone else whispered something that sparked another round of laughter. Ethan's expression didn't change much, but his jaw tightened just enough to show the line between patience and dismissal had been crossed. "I think we're done here," he said, turning slightly toward security. The guard stepped in again, guiding Marcus back toward the exit, the glass doors reflecting the scene in fragments. Faces, lights, movement, all slightly distorted. Marcus didn't resist. He let himself be moved, his hand lowering to his side, the small piece of metal still resting between his fingers. As he reached the threshold, he glanced back once, not at the people, not at Ethan, but at the model itself. And for the briefest moment, under the cold white lights, it looked less like a future and more like a memory he hadn't finished carrying. The glass doors closed behind him with a soft seal, muting the laughter into something distant and hollow, like it belonged to another world entirely. Outside, the late afternoon air carried a chill that slipped easily through the seams of Marcus Reed's coat, but he did not react to it. He stood still for a moment on the wide concrete steps, the kind poured thick to hold the weight of crowds, of time, of decisions made far above street level. Cars moved in steady lines along the avenue, engines humming, tires whispering against asphalt, the rhythm of a city that never paused long enough to notice who had just been pushed out of its brightest rooms. In his hand, The small metal fragment caught a sliver of light, dull but familiar, and he turned it slowly between his fingers as if aligning it with something only he could measure. His eyes lifted, not toward the towering glass facade behind him, but across the skyline stretching out in layers of steel and stone, each building rising with intention, each line drawn by someone who believed they understood what would last. Marcus took a breath, slow and measured, and began to walk, his steps unhurried, steady, following a path that did not need to be seen to be known. 2 blocks down, the shine of the development district began to fade into older streets, where brick replaced glass and the sidewalks carried the uneven marks of decades instead of months. A construction fence rattled lightly in the breeze, orange mesh pulled tight around a half-cleared lot where machines sat idle, their arms frozen mid-task. Marcus slowed as he approached, his gaze dropping to the ground where the concrete had been cut open, exposing the layers beneath. He stepped closer, stopping just short of the barrier, and crouched slightly, studying the edge where old foundation met new excavation. His fingers hovered just above the surface, not touching this time, but tracing the air as if remembering the weight, the depth, the way it all connected beneath what people could see. A man in a reflective vest stood nearby, leaning against a pickup truck, watching him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Sight is closed," the worker called out, not unkindly, just firm enough to establish distance. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the boundary without argument, but he did not move right away. His eyes followed a hairline crack running along the exposed concrete, subtle enough to be missed by anyone not looking for it, and his brow tightened almost imperceptibly. He straightened slowly, the city noise filling the space between moments, and turned to continue down the block. As he passed beneath an overpass, the light shifted, shadows stretching long and cool, the air carrying the faint scent of oil and rain that had not fallen yet. A few makeshift shelters lined the far side, blankets folded, belongings stacked with care, small signs of lives built from what was left behind. Marcus moved toward one of them, setting down the metal piece beside a worn backpack before lowering himself onto the edge of a crate. His posture remained upright, composed, as if the ground beneath him still mattered in a way others had forgotten. Above him, traffic rolled on, thousands of pounds moving over reinforced spans, over joints and supports designed to endure stress no one thought about anymore. Marcus tilted his head slightly, listening, not to the noise itself, but to what sat beneath it, the subtle shifts, the patterns, the language of structure that never truly went silent. His eyes closed for a brief second, then opened again, steady, focused, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the coat on his back and everything to do with the city rising around him, piece by piece, exactly as he remembered it. Back inside the gallery, the air had settled, but not completely. Conversations resumed in low, measured tones, yet something faint lingered beneath them, like a note that had not resolved. Ethan Caldwell stood near the model again, hands loosely clasped in front of him, eyes scanning the layout as if nothing had interrupted the flow of the evening. The presentation screens flickered back to life, displaying clean renderings of towers and streets bathed in artificial sunlight, projections of a future that looked flawless from every angle. Around him, investors and partners leaned in, nodding, asking questions about timelines, returns, structural efficiency, all the language of certainty. But Ethan was not fully listening. His gaze drifted, almost imperceptibly, to the section Marcus had touched, the small bridge near the central district where the metal piece had come loose. It had already been adjusted, repositioned by one of the assistants, but something about it felt slightly off, not visually, but in a way he could not immediately define. He reached out, pressing lightly against the structure, testing its stability, then pulled his hand back, the motion subtle enough that no one commented. "As you can see," one of the lead architects continued, gesturing toward the model, "the foundation integrates modern reinforcement systems that exceed current safety standards by over 20%. The words were confident, practiced, but they seemed to hang a fraction longer than usual. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging, yet his mind replayed a different voice, quieter, steadier, saying the opposite with no hesitation. He shifted his stance, glancing toward his assistant, a young woman holding a tablet filled with schematics. Pull up the substructure plans, he said, his tone even, giving no indication of concern. The assistant hesitated for a brief second, then complied, swiping through layers of data until the deeper framework appeared on the screen. Lines and measurements filled the display, numbers precise down to fractions of an inch, load distributions calculated to withstand forces most people never thought about. Ethan studied it, his eyes moving quickly, trained to spot inconsistencies, but nothing stood out at first glance. Still, the unease did not leave. Zoom in on the central district, he added, and the image shifted, isolating the exact area Marcus had pointed toward without ever naming it. A few of the engineers leaned closer now, curiosity replacing casual interest. One of them adjusted his glasses, scanning the details, then nodded as if to confirm everything was in order. "It is solid," the engineer said, confident, but his voice carried a slight edge, as if responding to something unspoken. Ethan remained silent for a moment longer, then stepped back, allowing the presentation to continue, but his attention stayed anchored to that section of the design. Across the room, the laughter from earlier had faded into polite conversation, yet a few guests still glanced toward the entrance, as if expecting something else to happen. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched into the evening, lights beginning to flicker on one by one, each window illuminating a small piece of life within a much larger structure. Ethan turned his head slightly, looking out at the skyline, at the buildings that had defined his success, each one a statement of control, of vision brought into reality. And yet, for the first time in a long while, that control felt less absolute. Behind him, the presentation continued, numbers, projections, promises layered neatly into a narrative of progress. But beneath it all, a single sentence lingered, quiet and persistent, refusing to dissolve into the background. "This will not hold." Ethan exhaled slowly, his reflection faint in the glass, superimposed over the city he believed he understood completely, and for a brief moment, the certainty he carried so easily began to shift, just enough to be noticed, not by the room, but by him alone. The evening stretched deeper into night, and the gallery slowly emptied, leaving behind the faint scent of polished wood and the quiet hum of lights that no longer needed to impress anyone. Ethan Caldwell remained, standing alone near the model, his jacket draped neatly over a chair, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest he was still working, still in control. The large screens had gone dark, but the city in miniature still sat illuminated under soft white beams, every line and structure frozen in perfection. He stepped closer again, this time without the weight of an audience, and crouched slightly, bringing his eyes level with the section Marcus had studied. The bridge, the foundation lines beneath it, the subtle intersection where old infrastructure met new ambition. He reached out once more, pressing gently, then pausing, his fingers hovering as if expecting something to respond. Nothing moved, nothing shifted, and yet, the certainty he relied on did not return. He straightened slowly, exhaling through his nose, then turned toward the far wall where a series of archival photographs had been mounted for aesthetic contrast, black and white images of the city decades earlier, before. Glass towers replaced brick and steel beams rose where older foundations had once held steady. Ethan had passed them earlier without a glance, but now something pulled his attention back. He walked toward them, footsteps echoing softly across the polished floor, and stopped in front of a photograph showing a construction site from nearly 40 years ago. Men stood along a partially built structure, their figures small against the skeleton of what would become part of the downtown core. The image was grainy, time-worn, but the lines of the foundation were unmistakable. Ethan leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he traced the layout in his mind, comparing it to the model behind him. There was a resemblance, not exact, but foundational, like a blueprint that had been adapted, extended, reimagined over time. A small plaque beneath the photograph listed the project name and a handful of credited engineers, names that had long since become part of industry history. Ethan read them once, then again, slower this time, his focus sharpening as he moved down the list. Something about the spacing, the structure, the methodology referenced in the caption, it aligned too closely with what he had just reviewed. He turned back toward the model, then back to the photograph, the connection forming not as a clear answer, but as a question that refused to be dismissed. Behind him, the silence of the gallery pressed in, amplifying the smallest sounds, the faint buzz of electricity, the distant city noise filtering through thick glass. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, and paused before unlocking it, his reflection staring back at him for a brief second. Controlled, certain, untouched. He unlocked the screen and pulled up the project files again, scrolling past polished summaries until he reached the deeper documentation, the historical integration reports most investors never cared to read. His thumb slowed as he reached a section referencing legacy structural systems, the original framework that the new design had been built upon. He tapped it open, eyes scanning quickly, then stopping. A name appeared there, not highlighted, not emphasized, just embedded. Within technical language, as if it did not matter anymore. Marcus Reed. The letters sat quietly on the screen, but the weight behind them shifted something in Ethan's posture almost instantly. He read it again, confirming, then cross-referenced the archival image, his gaze moving between past and present, between what had been built and what was now being rebuilt. The room felt different now, not larger or smaller, but deeper, as if layers he had never needed to consider were suddenly present all at once. Ethan lowered the phone slightly, his mind replaying the moment at the model, the calm certainty in Marcus's voice, the way he had not argued, had not tried to prove anything, had simply stated what would happen. Outside, the city lights burned steady, unaware of the shift happening within a single room, within a single realization that had not yet fully taken shape. Ethan stood there, caught between the image of a man dismissed at the door and the name now etched quietly into the very foundation of everything he was about to build. And for the first time, the project in front of him felt less like a future he controlled and more like a past he did not understand. The name did not fade when Ethan Caldwell locked his phone. It stayed, pressing against his thoughts with a quiet persistence that refused to be filed away as coincidence. Marcus Reed. It sounded ordinary when spoken, almost forgettable, but here, embedded in structural documentation that predated half the skyline, it carried weight that could not be ignored. Ethan turned back toward the model once more, slower this time, his steps measured, his attention sharper, as if the room itself had shifted into something more revealing. He studied the central district again, the lines, the supports, the calculated symmetry, but now he was not looking at what had been designed recently. He was looking through it, past the polished surface into something older, something foundational that had been quietly inherited. His hand hovered above the model again, not touching, just tracing the air above it, mirroring a gesture he had seen only minutes earlier. The memory landed differently now, not as an interruption, but as a warning he had dismissed too quickly. Ethan straightened and turned toward the far end of the gallery where a long table still held scattered documents, printed reports, backup schematics prepared for deeper review. Most of the guests had ignored them, trusting the summaries, trusting him. Ethan reached for one of the binders, flipping it open with practiced efficiency, pages sliding past, until he found the section on legacy integration again. The language was dense, technical, designed to compress decades of engineering into a few digestible paragraphs, but now every line seemed heavier. He read slower, absorbing more, noticing references that had once felt routine. Original load distribution matrices, subterranean reinforcement grid, adaptive stress channels. Each term pointed back to a system that had not been built by his firm, but inherited, modified, extended. Built by someone else. Built by Marcus Reed. A quiet tension settled into his shoulders. Not panic. Not yet, but something closer to discomfort that could not be explained away. Ethan closed the binder halfway, his fingers resting against the edge as he looked up, eyes drifting again toward the glass walls where the real city stretched out in full scale. Towers he had claimed, projects he had led, deals he had closed, all of it resting on something he had never questioned deeply enough. Behind him, a faint sound broke the stillness. One of the junior engineers, who had stayed behind to collect equipment, approached hesitantly, holding a tablet close to his chest. "Mr. Caldwell," he said carefully, not wanting to overstep, "there is something you might want to see." Ethan turned, his expression composed but attentive, and gestured for him to continue. The engineer stepped closer, unlocking the tablet and bringing up a structural simulation, the kind usually reserved for internal validation. Lines shifted across the screen, numbers recalculating in real time, stress points lighting up in subtle gradients. We ran a deeper analysis on the central district, the engineer explained, his voice steady but carrying a slight edge of uncertainty. It meets current standards, but there is a variable. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of variable? The engineer hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then zoomed in on a specific section. The underlying framework was designed for a different load philosophy. It can support what we are building, but only if certain conditions remain stable. If those conditions change, even slightly, the stress distribution could shift in ways we did not initially model. Ethan's gaze fixed on the screen, absorbing the implications without reacting outwardly. And what changes those conditions? He asked quietly. The engineer swallowed, then answered. Time, pressure, modification, or miscalculation. The word hung there, heavier than the rest. Ethan looked back at the model, then at the tablet, then out at the city again, the connection tightening into something undeniable. Marcus had not guessed. He had known. The realization settled in slowly, not explosive, but deep, like something aligning beneath the surface. Ethan exhaled once, controlled, and closed the binder fully, the soft thud echoing lightly in the empty gallery. Run the full analysis, he said, his tone calm, but firmer now. Every scenario. I want to see where it fails. The engineer nodded quickly and stepped away, leaving Ethan alone again with the model, the documents, and the weight of a truth that had just begun to unfold. Outside, traffic moved as it always did, unaware, uninterrupted, but inside, something had shifted permanently. For the first time, Ethan was not looking at a project he owned. He was looking at a system he did not fully understand, built by a man he had just had removed without a second thought. The city settled into night with a quiet persistence, lights stretching across windows and streets like a network of steady signals, each one unaware of the deeper tension threading beneath it. Under the overpass, Marcus Reed remained where he had been, seated on the edge of the crate, his posture still composed, his breathing even, as if time moved differently around him. The distant hum of traffic rolled above, filtered through layers of concrete and steel, a constant vibration that most people stopped hearing long ago. But Marcus listened, not to the noise itself, but to the rhythm beneath it, the subtle shifts that told a different story, one written in weight and balance rather than sound. His fingers rested loosely against his knee, then lifted slightly, hovering in the air as if measuring something invisible. He tilted his head a fraction, eyes narrowing just enough to focus, not on what was in front of him, but on what lay beneath the surface. A truck passed overhead, heavier than the rest, its load pressing down through the structure, and Marcus's gaze followed the movement instinctively, mapping the stress as it traveled through joints and supports. He exhaled slowly, the breath carrying a quiet recognition, not surprise, not fear, just confirmation. The same pattern, the same strain. He lowered his hand, letting it rest again, and looked out toward the edge of the street where the glow of a streetlight cast long shadows across cracked pavement. A few feet away, the small metal fragment he had carried from the model lay beside his bag, catching the faint light, its edges worn in a way that suggested it had once belonged somewhere more important. Marcus leaned forward, picking it up again, turning it between his fingers with deliberate care. For a moment, the present seemed to blur, replaced by something older, something built piece by piece under a different sky, with different hands, guided by a purpose that had never been about profit or recognition. His eyes softened slightly, not with nostalgia, but with memory that had weight, memory that still lived in the structures surrounding him. Above, another wave of traffic passed, and this time the vibration lingered a fraction longer, subtle but distinct. Marcus's expression tightened just enough to register it. Not failure. Not yet. But movement. Adjustment. A system beginning to respond to pressures it had not been designed to carry indefinitely. He shifted his position, planting his feet more firmly against the ground, his palm pressing lightly against the concrete beside him. The surface was cool, steady, but beneath it, he could feel the story continuing, layers interacting, forces redistributing in ways that only someone who had built it from the beginning, could fully understand. He closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to listen more clearly, removing everything visual, everything distracting, until there was only the structure, the weight, the truth of how it held together. When he opened them again, his gaze was sharper, more resolved. He looked toward the direction of the gallery, though it was far beyond sight, and for a brief moment, something like quiet certainty settled into his posture. Not anger, not urgency, just the knowledge that what had been ignored would not remain hidden for long. The city above him continued without pause, unaware of the silent conversation happening beneath its surface, unaware that the man sitting in the shadows understood every inch of what held it up, and every flaw beginning to reveal itself with time. The call came just after midnight, quiet but urgent enough to cut through the last layer of controlled calm inside Ethan Caldwell's office. He stood alone in the upper floor of his building, the city spread beneath him in perfect alignment, every streetlight and tower reinforcing the illusion of stability he had spent years building. His phone vibrated once against the glass desk before he picked it up, eyes already narrowing as he saw the name of the lead engineer. He answered without greeting. "Tell me." There was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, but wait, the kind that came before delivering something that could not be taken back. "We ran the full structural simulations," the engineer said, voice steady but strained at the edges. "All scenarios, every load condition, and the results are consistent." Ethan did not move, his reflection faint in the dark window behind him. "Go on." Another pause, shorter this time. "The system holds under current conditions, but the margin is thinner than expected. If the redevelopment proceeds as planned, the added stress over time will shift the distribution beyond tolerance. Not immediately, not visibly, but eventually, the integrity will degrade." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Define eventually." "Months, maybe a year," the engineer replied. "It depends on environmental factors. Traffic load increases, minor modifications. The problem is not the new design alone. It is how it interacts with the original framework." Silence settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not in frustration, but in recognition. "And the original framework," he said quietly, "was built under a different philosophy." "Yes," the engineer confirmed. "A different approach to load distribution. Whoever designed it accounted for variables we are only now identifying. It is unconventional, but effective within its intended limits." Ethan opened his eyes again, gaze locking onto the skyline as if he could see through it, through every layer of concrete and steel down to the foundation itself. "And if we continue without adjustment?" The answer came immediately this time. "The system will fail to adapt. It will not collapse suddenly, but the stress will accumulate. Cracks will form. Weak points will emerge. Over time, it will become unstable." The word lingered longer than any of the others. Unstable. Ethan ended the call without another word, lowering the phone slowly onto the desk. The office felt different now, not larger or smaller, but quieter in a way that amplified every thought. He turned, walking toward the window, each step deliberate, controlled, as if the ground beneath him required more attention than it ever had before. The city stretched out in front of him, unchanged, unaware, every structure standing exactly as it had hours earlier. But now he saw it differently, not as isolated achievements, but as a connected system, one that depended entirely on something deeper, something he had never built. Marcus Reed. The name returned, not as a question, but as an answer he had tried to ignore. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the glass, feeling the faint vibration of the building, subtle but constant, a reminder that nothing truly stood still. His mind replayed the moment at the gallery again, the calm voice, the certainty, the lack of hesitation. This will not hold. It had not been a warning meant to provoke. It had been a statement of fact. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling fully into place. He had not been challenged by a stranger. He had been corrected by the one man who understood the city better than anyone alive. And he had dismissed him without a second thought. Outside, a line of headlights moved steadily across a bridge in the distance. Thousands of pounds of motion crossing structures designed decades ago, each second adding pressure, each mile adding strain. Ethan watched it in silence, the connection clear now, undeniable. The project was not just at risk. The entire system beneath it was being pushed toward a limit it was never meant to exceed. And somewhere beneath it all, in the shadows of the same city, the man who had built that system was still there, unseen, unheard, carrying knowledge no report or simulation could fully replicate. Ethan straightened slowly, his posture shifting, not with panic, but with decision forming. For the first time since the project began, the path forward was no longer about expansion or control. It was about understanding, and there was only one person who could provide it. The decision did not wait for morning. Ethan Caldwell was already in motion before the first light touched the edges of the skyline, his car cutting through the quiet streets with a purpose that felt unfamiliar, stripped of presentation and control. The city looked different at this hour, less polished, more honest, the glass towers reflecting pale blue instead of artificial gold, the streets carrying only the early movement of delivery trucks and distant footsteps. He watched it all through the window, not as an owner, not as a builder, but as someone searching for something he had overlooked for too long. The address came from a combination of instinct and fragments, locations near the older districts, near the structures that still carried the original framework beneath newer layers. He stopped near the overpass just as the first hint of sunlight broke across the horizon, casting long shadows over concrete and steel. The engine went silent, and for a moment, he did not move. The weight of everything he had realized settled into the stillness around him, not overwhelming, but undeniable. Then he stepped out, the cool air sharp against his skin, his eyes adjusting quickly to the dim light beneath the structure. It did not take long to find him. Marcus Reed sat exactly where he had been, as if time had not shifted at all, his posture steady, his presence quiet but grounded in a way that made everything around him feel less stable by comparison. Ethan approached slowly, each step deliberate, the distance between them closing without the noise of an audience, without the shield of authority. For the first time, there were no cameras, no investors, no assistants filling the silence with distraction. Just two men and the weight of what stood between them. Marcus did not look up immediately. His attention remained on the ground, his hand resting lightly against the concrete as if still listening, still reading something deeper than what could be seen. Ethan stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to acknowledge the space he had ignored before. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but necessary, giving shape to the moment. Ethan's voice, when it came, was lower than usual, stripped of command, carrying something closer to clarity. You were right. The words settled into the air without resistance, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. Marcus lifted his gaze then, not surprised, not defensive, just aware, his eyes steady as they met Ethan's for the first time without interruption. There was no triumph in them, no satisfaction, only recognition. Ethan held the look for a second longer before continuing, his tone still controlled, but different now, less certain, more precise. The system cannot carry what we are planning to build. Marcus said nothing at first, letting the statement stand on its own, letting Ethan hear it without correction. Then he shifted slightly, removing his hand from the ground and sitting upright, his attention fully present now. It was never meant to, he replied quietly, his voice even, not accusatory, just factual. The city above them moved on, unaware, traffic beginning to pick up as the day prepared to take shape, each passing vehicle adding weight to the structures beneath. Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing the simplicity of the answer, the difference between knowing something and understanding it. Then help me understand it, he said, the words landing with a weight that carried more than just the request. Marcus studied him for a brief moment, not measuring status, not evaluating power, but something deeper, something rooted in intention. The silence returned again, but this time it felt different, not empty, but full of possibility, of a shift that had already begun to take hold. Marcus glanced once toward the city beyond the overpass, then back to Ethan, his expression unchanged but resolved in a way that did not need to be spoken. The distance between them had not disappeared, but it had changed, no longer defined by dismissal, but by something quieter, something that could only move forward if it was met with understanding. And for the first time, Ethan did not try to fill the silence. He stood there, waiting, listening, as the foundation of everything he believed he controlled began to reshape itself into something far more real. The morning unfolded slowly above the overpass, sunlight filtering through gaps in concrete and steel, casting long, quiet lines across the ground where Marcus Reed stood beside Ethan Caldwell. The city had begun to wake, traffic building in steady layers, each passing vehicle adding weight, motion, and purpose to a system that most people never questioned. But here, beneath it all, the conversation had shifted into something deeper, something that did not rely on titles or authority. Marcus moved first, not with urgency, but with intention, stepping away from the shadow of the overpass and toward the open street where the older structures met the newer ones. Ethan followed without speaking, his pace matching, his attention fixed not on the surroundings, but on the man beside him. They stopped near the edge of a construction zone, the same one Marcus had studied the night before, the ground still exposed where layers of foundation revealed the history beneath. Marcus crouched again, this time placing his hand fully against the surface, fingers spread slightly, as if reconnecting with something that had never truly left him. This city was never built to grow endlessly, he said quietly, his voice steady, grounded in certainty rather than opinion. It was built to balance. Ethan stood just behind him, listening, not interrupting, allowing the words to settle without resistance. Marcus traced a faint line along the concrete, following a path that disappeared beneath newer material. Every structure carries weight, he continued. But the weight has to move. It has to be distributed, redirected, absorbed. If you keep adding without understanding how it flows, you do not build strength. You create pressure. Ethan's gaze followed the movement of Marcus's hand, seeing not just cracks or seams, but connections, relationships between parts of a system that had been invisible to him before. Marcus stood slowly, brushing his hand against his coat, then turned toward the skyline, where the newer towers reflected the rising sun. What you are building, he said, it does not respect what is already here. It assumes the foundation will adapt. But foundations do not adapt. They endure until they cannot. The words were not harsh, not accusatory, but they carried a finality that did not need emphasis. Ethan took a slow breath, the reality of it settling deeper than any report or simulation ever could. Then it needs to change, he said, his voice quieter now, but firm in a different way. Marcus looked at him, not measuring, not judging, just acknowledging the shift. Not just the design, Marcus replied. The intention. The city continued around them, unaware of the quiet recalibration taking place at its core. A crew began to arrive at the site, workers stepping out of trucks, preparing for another day of building, of adding to something they trusted without question. Ethan glanced toward them, then back at Marcus, understanding now that what needed to change would not be visible at first, not in the skyline, not in the announcements, but in the decisions made before anything else moved forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the project files on his phone, then paused, looking at them for a moment before lowering the device again. The plans, the timelines, the projections, they all felt incomplete